sharing with us and sorting that out. And welcome to this wonderful live stream event that we have streaming live from Labyrinth Books in Princeton, New Jersey, partnering with the Public Library of Princeton, New Jersey. Our live stream with Professors Anthony Grafton and Yaacob Dweck. Once again, I want to thank the Public Library for being our partner in this event and in many other events that we are hosting via live stream. So to check out any and all of those events, head to labyrinthbooks.com or the Public Library's website. And I also, of course, want to thank the Humanities Council of Princeton University for co-sponsoring this event and helping to get the word out. So at this event, we will be hearing a conversation between Professors Dweck and Professor Grafton about Professor Grafton's newest book, Inky Fingers, which has just been released from Harvard University Press, a very handsome edition. And just a quick reminder that you can purchase that over the phone or online at labyrinthbooks.com. And we're offering 10% off on this book for all orders. And Professor Grafton has graciously agreed to sign book plates. So if you would like a personalized copy or an autographed copy, feel free to stipulate that. And just one other quick word about a project here at Labyrinth that we're working on that you can help a neighbor or a friend in need and also help Labyrinth at the same time by donating to a free store where you can donate a monetary donation and a free book will be donated. You can find all the info on that and more at labyrinthbooks.com. So now on to our professors here. Professor Anthony Grafton is, of course, one of the distinguished faculty from across the street here at Princeton. And as professor of history, Professor Grafton's main interests lie in the cultural and intellectual history of Renaissance Europe, the history of print and scholarship, and the history of science. His past publications include The Footnote, A Curious History, Forgers and Critics, Creativity and Duplicity in Western Scholarship, The Culture of Correction in Renaissance Europe, and Leon Battista Alberti, Master Builder of the Italian Renaissance. He has been the recipient of many distinguished fellowships and awards, and his writing has also appeared frequently in the New York Review of Books. And he is joined in conversation tonight by his colleague, Professor Yaacob Dweck, Professor of History and in the program in Judaic Studies at Princeton University. His first book, The Scandal of Kabbalah, Leon Modena, Jewish Mysticism, Early Modern Venice, was published in 2011, and his latest book, Dissident Rabbi, was just published this past year. Now together, they will be talking about Professor Grafton's latest book, Inky Fingers, The Making of Books in Early Modern Europe, which is just out. And in this wide-ranging book, Grafton delves into a variety of cases from early modern Europe's world of print shops, bookmaking, and humanist scholarship. Now, banished are the archetypes of bookworm humanists collecting and reading texts with little manual work or repetitive labor making up their daily lives. Grafton provides readers with the whole context surrounding the creation of books by including many details and factors some have previously overlooked. By doing so, the difficult tasks of, among others, copying, collating, amending, and criticism are revealed to actually involve intense scrutiny and hard work. Now, personally, I found his chapter on the practice of divination in textual criticism eye-opening, having not conceived previously that this practice associated with necromancy would come to be a part of the humanist's toolbox. But there you have it, and I hope we will get to hear more about that. Grafton's book is rooted truly in the realities of life in Renaissance Europe, providing thought-provoking scholarship that shines a light on the evolution of knowledge, science, and scholarship. So without further ado, I would invite us all to turn now to what is sure to be an enlightening conversation followed by a brief time for questions. If you have any questions, those listening in, feel free to pose them in the Ask a Question tab down at the bottom. And for now, just sit back and enjoy this conversation between Professor Anthony Grafton and Professor Yaacob Dweck.
Wonderful. Did anyone hear anything I said, or it sounds like no? Okay, nope. Wonderful. Thank you, Labyrinth, and thank you, the library, for having us on this wonderful error-filled evening. Tony, this is not the first time that you have written a book. Let's talk about Inky Fingers. Let's talk about the title. Over the years, you've written a whole series of studies on the individual humanists. We have Scaliger, we have Cardano, we have Alberti. You've also written studies of individual scholarly practices, the footnote, the corrector. You could even include forgery and criticism in that one. The Ars Historica in What Was History. But punctuated over the last several decades, there have been volumes of essays, Defenders of the Text, Bring Out Your Dead, Worlds Made by Words. And now we have Inky Fingers. Can you talk a little bit about the title? This is a much more physical title. This is a much more material title than your books have given us in the past. It's almost as if, we're living in a material world of scholarship in the year 2020. Can you say a little bit about the title?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, first of all. Thanks to Labyrinth. Thanks to the library. Thanks to the Humanities Council. And thanks to you, Yaacob. That's a great question. So Inky Fingers refers to something that many people here have probably encountered. Robert Darnton, back in the 1970s, was tracing the history of the printing of the great French encyclopédie. And he found a copy that had an ink blot on it. And from the records of the printer, he was able to identify the actual pressman who had left his inky fingerprints on the book. And I mean, of course, I always envied him that wonderful, vivid discovery. But I also came to think over time, as I looked into printing shops, as I began to see in a more material way what it took to produce a learned book in the 16th or 17th century, I began to see that it wasn't just the printers who had inky fingers, and that I could actually both nail down lots of physical activity and partly physical activity that went into the making of books, and I could date it and tie it to people. And by doing that, I thought I could give the practices of the learned a little of that vivid humanity that Bob Darnton was so wonderfully able to give the workers in the printing shops. As I wanted to show that scholarship is also work. It's not simply a refined contemplation. It was carried out in difficult circumstances, under deadlines, with what look by our standards like primitive tools. And it cost immense labor. It cost scholars their eyesight. It gave them bad backs. It crippled their hands. But more to the point, it always involved a combination of mental and physical work. And that was the world I wanted to bring back to life.
Mm-hmm. Can you say something about the interest in the history of books and the interest in intellectual history, and how these interests have intersected and crisscrossed over the years, both in your scholarship, but also in Princeton itself, and as an intellectual scholarly commons, and how they intersect in this book itself, in Inky Fingers?
Thank you. So I started out as an intellectual historian, a historian of science. I was interested in astronomy, a very technical part of intellectual history. And almost from the start, I began to notice how much you could see about a particular finished looking work of scholarship if you could find the working materials or fragments of them that its author had left behind, or if you could find copies that contemporaries had read and annotated and criticized. That gave one a different perspective on intellectual history. Again, it became a kind of more human transaction. Over time, these two interests have not tended to meld all that much. There's a history of books on Reader, which looks at annotated books, looks at marginalia, looks at underlinings, looks at and recreates the practices of Reader from these very scattered and often difficult bits of evidence. And there's intellectual history, a part of which has become interested, thanks to the work of Lorraine Daston and others, in the practices of scholars, not just their big ideas, but the way they actually looked at sources, copied them, edited them, emended them, and so on. And Princeton was a great center of both kinds of work for my time here, with wonderful intellectual and cultural history being done by Carl Shorsky, Jerry Siegel, Natalie Davis, and others, and wonderful book history also being done by Bob Darnton, who is really creating the field, by Roger Chartier down the road at Penn and often visiting here, and by Natalie Davis as one of her many interests. So in a sense, what I've been trying to do in the last 10 years or so is to pull these things together a bit and see if looking at someone like Spinoza as a reader of earlier texts and someone who was read by scholars as well as philosophers could shed a further light on what he was thinking and how he made his thesaurus theologico-politicus.
Can you say something about what you think you've managed to do in this book as a whole, as a sort of coherent set of essays rather than just simply standalone text? We'll talk about the standalone nature in a minute, but can you say something about how this book sort of hangs together as its own coherence?
I think the book hangs together in a couple of ways. One way is simply to show that some of the really powerful innovations in early modern thought were brought about by scholars who were really doing more work than thinking, who were compiling, who were putting texts together, who were looking at texts in a different way because they'd read them and pulled excerpts from them and compiled them under different categories. So, for example, how did it become normal to think of Christianity as an offspring of Judaism, to think that Jewish sources could shed light not just on the Hebrew Bible, but also on Christianity itself, especially in its early centuries? And in this book, I try to argue that the people who first began to make such arguments and first began to use Jewish sources to think about Christianity were doing so not as philosophical historians in the 18th century, but as scholars who compiled material and found after a while that they were seeing the past in a different way. So that's one of the things I hope I've brought over.
And here we come almost full circle to your first collection of essays, Defenders of the Text, which is to sort of bring back in time, but also and pull it away from the discipline of philosophy, this moment of rupture in the 18th century, and move it earlier, and possibly make an argument for intellectual continuity over the course of time. If you look at the table of contents of Inky Fingers, we meet characters like Jean Mabillon, Polydore Virgil, Matthew Parker, Francis Daniel Pastorius, Annius of Viterbo, and John Keyes. Now, with the exception of a small town in England by the name of Cambridge, no one has ever heard of any of these characters. Besides, I can't even think of anyone. But maybe you could say a little bit about why work on people who are not household names outside of anywhere? We'll get to the character Spinoza in a second, but can you say something about the obscurity of the subjects of most of Inky Fingers?
That's perfectly true. I've always had a taste for people whose names are not canonical, whose works are not actually read very often. And I've tried to work out, as I look at this past world of scholarship, exactly who it is who is making really interesting radical moves, who it is who is pushing a discourse along. And I've always had an eye out for the people who did this without making a name that became part of Western civilization as a construct. Now, there are a couple of big figures in this book. Erasmus plays a fairly prominent role, and as you said, Spinoza. But I really love looking at these people who aren't remembered, but who had incredibly fertile ideas and insights, and who show that the apparently dull pursuits of unknown scholars can have powerful results. One of the things I try to argue about Francis Daniel Pastorius, who is a household name in Philadelphia, he founded Germantown, his house still survives, is that he's an incredible compiler. He put together one of the most magnificent commonplace books anywhere. It's in the University of Pennsylvania library. It's Peter Stallybrass's favorite manuscript, and he got me to look at it. And what I found as I looked at Pastorius and his career and this commonplace book was you could see in his practices as a scholar the roots of the one document he wrote, which remains somewhat well known, the Germantown Protest of 1688, which was the first document written in the British colonies that protested against the holding of African slaves. And you can see in that document the very practices that he had cultivated as a student in Germany and in Strasbourg and as a scholar in the Pennsylvania wilderness. So that's the kind of thing I like to find when I can. I hope I'm not making it up.
So let's talk about Spinoza, which is the last I believe it's the last chapter right before the end, but
that's right.
You have an amazing description on page 235, which I'm going to read one sentence. And this is about Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus. You write, quote, "The Bible was not an encyclopedia and authoritative description of the universe, but rather a rough guide to morality put together quickly to serve the needs of a primitive people." It's a really elegant description of what Spinoza manages to do in the Theological Politico treatise. And at the same time, if I read this chapter correctly, one of the things that you seem to be doing is to put Spinoza back into a world himself, where he is much less this Paul Hazard-like figure who has made a rupture and the first person to historicize the Bible, but you show that he's taking it from many different sources. I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on Spinoza and these earlier traditions of criticism.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried to put Spinoza back into a part of his world to which most scholars have been less attentive than they have to the theologians with whom he was in dialogue, and he certainly was, or the philosophers with whom he was in dialogue. and to show that he had plenty of inspiration in the immediate world in which he was writing, that you could see him in some ways responding to pamphlets written by scholars already considering questions like, what is the state of preservation of the Hebrew Bible? Is it a reliable text? Is the Greek text perhaps more reliable? Would Moses recognize the text if he came back to life? That's not something Spinoza said. It's something Isaac Vossius said, one of my unknown scholars. So by putting Spinoza back in that world, I tried to show that he took inspiration from a wider range of sources and people than has usually been thought. The other thing I tried to show is that he was a total amateur in scholarship. And this is a very good thing. It was because he was an amateur that he came up with a radical conclusion. He decided that the biblical text had been redacted, that the text of the Hebrew Bible as we have it was put together much later than almost any of the events it describes, probably by Ezra, though he's cagey about insisting that. And yeah, that for him shows that you can't remotely trust the text as a guide to the past or history. Now, this is an alluring position, and of course it comes close to the way historical scholarship would treat the Hebrew Bible now in terms of being a key to the literal past. But in his time, lots of people knew that the Old Testament had been redacted. The young Leibniz got hold of a copy of the Tractatus very early, and he writes in it, sure, it was redacted. Homer was redacted too. That doesn't mean we don't have these texts.
Right.
If Spinoza had had that scholarly formation, he would never have written the Tractatus.
This reminds me, this notion of the importance of the amateur reminds me of Edward Said's description of himself as an amateur with music at the beginning of Musical Elaborations, where he talks about, you know, the importance of, or even in a book by Stephen Chapin and Simon Schaffer, where they talk about playing the outsider. These studies were written basically over the last decade, maybe a decade and a half. Can you say a little bit about how the field has changed over the last decade and a half, but not only the field, but also how the practice of doing scholarship has changed over the course of, let's say, the last 15 years that you've been working on these articles?
Yeah, I wrote these articles during a period in which humanistic scholarship of the kind I do probably changed faster and more radically than it had in 100 years beforehand. There was the availability of digitized materials, the possibility of rapid communication by email and attachments and so on. But above all, there was the smartphone and the camera and the growing readiness of librarians to allow readers to take pictures of archival documents and rare books, which is actually a good thing from a conservation standpoint, as you don't keep the book open for 3 months the way we used to when we had to copy out every note by hand. And that's been just transformative. Students can go, a graduate student can go to England or the continent during the fall break when it's possible to travel and come back with 1,000 images that make possible the writing, not of a traditional term paper, but of a learned article, an article that a good journal will accept with enthusiasm. And we've seen this more and more. I don't think you can call this democratization in itself, though if you go to the English National Archive and see people there who can only be there for a day, who are not scholars by profession and see them loading up with pictures to pursue a project of their own, there can be a democratic element in it. But it certainly has transformed the way that young early modern historians do their work. You can leap into the unknown depths of the archive in your second or third year in graduate school in a way, or even as an undergraduate writing a senior thesis in a way that was never possible before. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the material conditions of scholarship have gone with a much deeper interest in scholars' working papers, scholars' methods and practices, the history of the way texts were read after they were published. This has all really exploded as a field. And that's partly because the foundations were laid before the technology came along. The methods were mostly laid out, but the intensity of this work and the range and the scale of it is completely new. So we were getting interested in practices, reading this much more material and local and site-specific kind of intellectual history. And Apple put the tool in our hands that made it possible to do it earlier and more elaborately. Mm-hmm. I myself, in this period, have had the fate that Max Weber prophesies in his great speech on science as a calling. And if you're a successful scholar, younger scholars are interested by what you do, and they come and they show where you're wrong. So you end up being paved over in your own lifetime, which is, painful, but it's also gratifying in a way. As each spadeful of asphalt falls on me, I know it wouldn't be there if I hadn't done my work in the beginning. So that's all. These are also the papers that came out of that period.
Fritz Stern used to say that if you're an historian, you have two fates. You can either be disagreed with or ignored, and it's better to be disagreed with. I want to, in my last question, before we open the floor up, I want to talk to you, or I want to get you to talk a little bit about the relationship between scholarship and crisis. A lot of these figures that you write about are living in some pretty terrible times. Keyes is dealing with the sweat. Spinoza is dealing with war. Pastorius is in Germantown in somewhat trying times when he's there. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, over the last 2 months, the world that we have been living in is very different from the world that we were living beforehand. We don't know what it's going to look like when the plague is over, but the last 8 to 9 weeks have been very different. Can you say a little bit about the relationship between scholarship and crisis, and about how that plays out for these characters with Inky Fingers that you've been living with for the last 10 to 15 years?
One of the things I always admire about these people is that they worked through times which were incredibly dangerous and trying. So Annius of Viterbo, who is one of my favorite figure, he forges more than 20 mutually corroborating histories of the ancient world and writes a commentary on them, which shows why they're better than the Greek and Roman historians. And this becomes a bestseller, which dominates most people's understanding of ancient history, down to Spinoza, who still uses one of these forgeries. He published this in 1498, which is a fairly terrifying moment. He's in Rome. This is the moment in which Savonarola had led Florence almost into a schism. It's a moment in which the Florentine Republic has rebelled against the Medici, and there's great tension in Florence and between Florence and the papacy. The papacy itself wages wars against its subject cities. Annius himself is poisoned to death by Cesare Borgia, son of the Pope. These are people who were not leading the sort of purportedly easy life of a tenured professor in an American university. Yeah, and I find this absolutely fascinating, that in some way these pursuits enabled them to do things that were meaningful to them, that gave them consolation, that gave them a way of dealing with, in Spinoza's case, the terrors of revolution in Holland. In Pastorius's case, the difficulties of trying to live in a very rough frontier and to work out laws that were in keeping with the principles of the Quaker religion, and on and on.
So do you see these characters as a sort of latter day 16th and 17th century parallels to Boethius? And their scholarship as sort of early modern versions of the sort of consolations of philosophy. He's in his prison and wherever it is in Pavia, I think, and writing this masterpiece, and these figures are doing sort of similar things.
Some of them I see as Boethius, as finding consolation in scholarship more than in philosophy. Some of them, I think, are doing their best to remedy what they see as the problems around them, as I think Spinoza was. I think Spinoza saw biblical authority as one of the roots of terrible problems, even in the Dutch Republic. And, in that sense, his interest in deconstructing it was very deliberate and very engaged in the world around him. So
every polity thinks it's the chosen people, right?
Absolutely. So for that, for me, sitting in my house in the plague year, I do find some consolation in going back to the worlds of these people and trying to, sit next to them and watch them working.
Matt, do you want us to take some questions? Do you want to call out some questions from the floor?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's a great perspective, by the way. It's great to keep in mind, thinking about, not knowing what will come of this. Certainly some bad, but hopefully also some good and some new insights and that sort of thing. So I have, just to start off here, a question that I'll read out from Vidushi Sharma. Tony, so fascinated by your work on the history of reading and marginalia. Have you seen any examples of the internet being used as a connecting fabric to allow people to, for example, create commonplace books together?
Not the internet as such. I've worked with 5 other people to write a play as a Google Doc. And that was definitely a kind of collaboration. We were basing it on historical materials. It was actually a reconstruction. So we were working from materials that we all had in our different computers and phones, and working together on a single Google Doc in which we were trying to coin this into dialogue. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to this. There are some very interesting crowdsourced projects now taking place for editing the papers of Bentham, for example. So yeah, there's a lot of potential in here. One thing I learned about during the exodus of students and professors from campus is a system called Perusal, which lets you post documents for your students to annotate and discuss with one another. It's a system desired at Harvard. You can use the basic system for free, and it really is a kind of wonderful teaching tool, and one that works entirely by marginal annotation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Great. We have another question here from Yaacob. And short and sweet, succinct. He asks, what did divination mean as a scholarly practice?
So divination is the term which scholars have used with pride since the 18th century for conjectural emendation. When you look at a text and you say, this can't be what it said, here's what it said. And And there are many famous cruxes in Shakespeare. At the death of Falstaff, it's said that he babbled a green fields. And since the 18th century, scholars have had bash after bash at that. It's pretty clearly a reference to the 23rd Psalm. But and if you look at the great classical scholars from Richard Bentley in the 18th century to A.E. Housman in the 20th, one of their claims to fame is the brilliance with which they could take an ungrammatical or unmetrical mess and turn it into real Latin or real Greek. Now, in the Renaissance, divination was greeted with great dubiety. Divination was a profession in the Renaissance. You went to an astrologer or you went to a diviner who told you what your future was going to be. And this was a very dubious practice. Astrologers were basically the consultants of the 15th and 16th centuries. You went to them, they gave you canned advice. It was always wrong. They always got better salaries. So there was a lot of satire about them, as there is about consultants. There was a lot of, there were efforts to outlaw them, as we sadly don't do for consultants. And there were other sorts of diviners who used dice. They threw hot metal into water. They opened the Bible at random. And that is what divining a text seemed like to Erasmus, for example, when he was young. And he's always very negative about divining, whether that kind of divining or textual divining. Mm-hmm. Okay, 1516, he's got a 9-volume edition of St. Jerome's works to produce, and he's sitting in the printer's workshop, and they're bringing him the sheets and saying, Erasmus, what does this mean? All of a sudden, Erasmus saw you couldn't edit a text, and it's true, you can't edit any text without divining, and he changes the valence of the term divining. He begins to put it on the title pages of his editions. Seneca, greatly improved by Erasmus's divinations. It's one of my favorite blurbs. He says, I've amended Seneca, and if you read his philosophy, he'll amend you. So divination goes from being something that's seen as disreputable, as problematic, as connected to with other kinds of problematic pursuits, to a core form of scholarship, as much an act of the imagination as of learning.
Mm-hmm. That's one heck of a 180 in the marketing there from Erasmus.
Right.
I've got another question here from Noam Level. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But he asks, Professor Grafton, you have worked for many years on different aspects of production and organization of knowledge, starting with what you defined as history of science. Lately, many of these aspects and more are starting to be considered as part of a broader category of the history of knowledge. What is your opinion on this new scholarly field? And field is in quotation marks.
I'm really not sure about the history of knowledge. It just strikes me as too broad to be a really useful category in itself. I think it indicates something which is very important. We started with the history of science because in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it seemed obvious that science was the characteristic set of disciplines of the modern world. Science was what had had a revolution. Science was the world of Newton, the world of Watson and Crick in the 50s. And, this was in part the argument of Snow's two cultures. But over time, as we look at the constellations of learning and prestige in the past, it turns out that this wasn't by any means taken for granted. Copernicus thought astronomy was magnificent. It was a technical field only mathematicians could enter. But Joseph Scaliger, the man on whom I spent 20 years, was pretty clear that astronomers didn't really know how to read their sources. And Scaliger was the one who got the first research professorship at the hottest university in Europe, in Leiden, in 1593. I mean, between the Alexandrian Library and the MacArthur Foundation, nobody else had a full-time research job. He was the most prestigious scholar in Europe, and he thought astronomers were for making fun of. History of knowledge has the merit of indicating that science was not the only complex set of disciplines, the only set of disciplines that had prestige, and the only set of disciplines that changed the world. And to that extent, I think it's been a good thing to see the term come into some use.
Mm-hmm, indeed. Another question. We've been getting quite a few coming in. John Hoffmeyer asks, first comments and then asks, your work has given voice to key figures whose contributions have been historically underrepresented in scholarly discourse, and you've mentioned several of them in talking about your book. He asks, what can be done today to make sure that the voices of amateur scholars are heard in a discourse still plagued by problems of elitism and exclusivity?
That's a drastic problem. And it's absolutely remains a terrible problem to this day. The greatest scholar of Renaissance Rome, of its sewers, its streets, its bridges, its obelisks, a very great scholar, Pamela Long, has never had a permanent academic position, though she's written magnificent books and articles. She is a great authority, and ended up, and she came out when I did in the 70s, when there weren't many jobs, and went a different way, and has wound up without a permanent position, though with a magnificent and totally deserved reputation and many research fellowships. And she's been both more skillful and luckier than most other people who work outside the academy. I do feel that there is some possibility now for people who work on fields outside their purported expertise to have an impact. I think of Michael Bellil's book, Arming America, which argued on the basis of very problematic use of sources that the 18th century Americans had very few weapons in their houses. And this book was deconstructed, not for the most part by professional historians, but in fact by people who were gun owners or believed in the Second Amendment, or who just were history buffs who thought he had the history wrong. Now, none of them got great prestige or warm thanks for this, but it was a major historical accomplishment, though very painful for him. So I think the existence of the web, the existence of the possibility of doing one's own digital publications has enabled some people I know to be very effective and to intervene in scholarly discussions and to create resources that scholars use. Nonetheless, it's a scholarship and science are both highly exclusive systems. They've been inhospitable to many kinds of people, women, people of different colors and religions. And that is, to the extent that we can do that within the university, it's a matter of taking people for their talents rather than their appearance or some prejudice one has about the place they come from. I do think that the American university now, which has, heaven knows, thousands of vaults. It turned out to be built of chicken wire and bubble gum, and when it got, as we learned with this stress test. But nonetheless, it's a more inclusive university now than it was when I started out in the 70s or than it was a generation ago. And that's a small cause for help. I hope that the disasters we're living through don't close off those developments, and I worry that they may.
Yeah, something weighing on all of our minds, I think. I think we have time for a couple more. I think I'll ask one, and then
Sure.
Professor Dweck, if I'll punt a final question and remark back to you. I wanted to get to this one that's been upvoted quite a bit by our viewers. This comes from Justin. How related are the changing material conditions of books and literacy in this first information age to the changing geopolitical landscape of early modern Europe? I am thinking particularly about the increased access to Jewish texts and the transatlantic nature of the book trade. How are these conditions stemming from the geopolitical landscape of Europe, and how did this information age change that landscape?
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So one point about the geopolitical world is it's the expulsion of Jews from Iberia and Sicily, a great center of Jewish learning, which takes Jews, some of whom convert, so many of whom don't, and Jewish texts into the Christian world, into Italy, for example, which creates the possibility for bigger settlements in Rome and in Venice and other cities. And these settlements become ghettos in the course of time in almost all cities. But it's these Jews who teach Christians about the Kabbalah. They're the ones who make it possible to print Jewish texts, which Christians couldn't do without them, to establish the texts, to do the press work, and to correct them. And that's a monumental change in Christian life. It means you go from having a very few Christians who, like Paul of Burgos, was a rabbi who converted to Christianity, or Nicholas of Lyra, someone who learned to appreciate Rashi's commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, to a world in which every scholar was expected to have some knowledge of Hebrew, some understanding of Jewish scholarship and Jewish tradition. And this didn't begin for scholarly reasons. This really begins with Jews in motion as the result of terrible and drastic political decisions. So for me, it's the place where reading and politics come together is Wittenberg in 1517 and after. I still believe that there was nothing given about the Protestant Reformation, the fracturing of the single Latin Christian church, the fracturing of Latin Christendom, and what would become increasingly diverse polities and societies and cultures, depending on the religious choices made by rulers and populations. But it started with one very powerful, very tormented theology teacher in a new provincial university in Saxony, reading St. Augustine and reading Paul and reading the Psalms and coming up with a new reading which transvalued everything. That's an extraordinary moment. It's made possible by printing, which made the texts available. It's made possible by Erasmus, who made it clear that you had to go back to the original texts, as Luther did, even though he was not a scholar in Erasmus' sense. But in the end, it's one person reading, and it's an infectious reading. In Halle, the Marienkirche, which is a wonderful church in the center of Halle, has its own library with about 40,000 books, mostly in Latin, from the 16th and 17th centuries, some in German. They have the library of a Lutheran woman from the time of Luther. She knew Luther, she knew his friends, they gave her books, and you can see her reading through her books, learning to read in the powerful new way of Luther, and applying lessons to herself in a very direct and magnificent way. That's a way in which the history of reading gets us into the Reformation in a way that other approaches have never quite done.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. To see the personal impact of that and everything.
And it's a great library. It's open about an hour a week, but the librarian is very nice. And if you're a scholar or a graduate student, she'll lock you in with her, and you can spend the whole day pulling books off the shelf.
Next time you're in Halle, drop by. Yes. Professor Dweck, did you want to have like a final remark and question before I give some parting words?
Sure. I just want to ask one question. I think this follows on the discussion about Luther. On page 242, you write about Spinoza. You say, the Tractatus, like many other great explosive works, was deeply overdetermined. But you seem to be making a very different kind of argument about Luther right now, which is that it was deeply unoverdetermined, if such a phrase works. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between texts, great books, and their being overdetermined or not.
Well, I think it depends. You know, when the great historian of philosophy, Richard Popkin, was asked, "What do you think of the history of books?" he said, "Depends on which book. It depends on which reader." Luther was somebody that nobody could determine. He was wild. He refused to bow to anybody's categories. So did Spinoza. But Spinoza seems to me to be someone who is so deliberate, so carefully using every tiny block of evidence that he knows to make a powerful case. And if he knew more evidence, the case wouldn't have been so powerful. So I just see them as they're both great readers. They're both magnificent readers, but in very different personalities, very different approaches to the task of reading.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So much to think about. I want to, again, remind everybody, Inky Fingers is out now. You can call the store. Tuesdays through Saturday, we are open 11 to 4. We can do curbside pickup, ship in the lower 48 states via US.
Or immediately after that, you get on the phone.
Yes. So yeah, call in or order online from labyrinthbooks.com. All the details are on labyrinthbooks.com. Just a quick reminder, you'll get 10% off this book, and you can also get a signed copy from Professor Grafton, who's graciously signing book plates. Highly recommended. There's so much to think about, and it really does tie it together. I've really enjoyed reading this book, and I can't thank both of you enough for being part of this. This has been a really wonderful talk. We will be posting this recording on our YouTube page, so be sure to look for that if you want to go back and hear anything like that. Otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, and take care and be safe.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And thanks to Labyrinth again, and to Matt and Dorothea.